Resident Evil Village is a game with engaging combat, nostalgic interfacing, and memorable characters. Throughout my playthrough, I walked through every hallway thinking that someone was going to get me. The Lycan's odd decision-making kept me on my toes, and my time in Lady Dimitrescu's castle was always freaky. But then, I started to get a nagging feeling. Something about this game wasn't right. More and more punchlines felt tone-deaf. The setting changed on a dime, and what I felt the game should have been about was nowhere near what it became. Part 1. The Primer. The game opens on the storybook, Village of Shadows, which is an artistic move that shows off the lighting engine and gives a prelude to the 4 houses we encounter throughout the game. The little girl seems to be an analogy for Rose at first glance, hence the girl, but her encounters are more closely related with Ethan. Then we see the tension between Ethan and Mia. Throughout the house, we find scattered clues about Ethan and Mia's lives since Resident Evil 7. Also, their house looks really nice. Then we put Rose to bed, providing our first cheesy dialogue.
I'll be right downstairs. Daddy won't let those weird fairy tale monsters get you.
I let this one slide, since I think he's kind of a cheesy dad anyway. After a heated conversation, Mia and Ethan are greeted by our asshole friend Chris Redfield. He and his goonies light Mia up, and here you might notice that she looks strangely unshocked by the first bullet. Even after she's hit with a dozen bullets, Chris shoots her in the head 5 times. You also might notice that she stops moving only after the last shot to the head, which initially made me think that Chris attacked her and took Rose because she was still infected and passed on some special gene to Rose. For some reason, Ethan isn't screaming after Mia's death, which could be believable if he was in shock, but his complete silence seems a lot less likely than screaming. Then my favorite line in the game.
Ethan, no.
Made Chris look like a bungling idiot who doesn't know how to communicate with people to ridiculous levels. And this continues as a main theme throughout the game. Ethan then has a funky dream where we learn that Mia might be hiding something important from us, and that's where we transition to the gameplay. Part 2. The Village. We open at a mysterious scene where we're next to a car crash and a corpse, which obviously raises a lot of questions. Why did we drive off the road so far? What did this? Why didn't it kill me? These are touched on later, so I won't go into detail here, but it immediately sets a tense and spooky tone. As we walk on the trail, following footprints, we begin to hear noises from what we will later learn are Lycans. Could they have killed Ethan here? Probably. Would they? I'm not so sure. Within our first couple encounters with the Lycans, their behavior seems less focused on killing things than serving a higher power. What we later learn is the Megamycete. A group of them attack us in the Radio Shack, but immediately back off after we kill one. Why? Probably because they got a call from their mama. The same thing happens when we have to run for our lives from a seemingly endless number of Lycans that even exceed the number of houses in the village, but more on that later. The encounter ends with zombie claws giving us a stare down before suddenly becoming distracted and hopping away. This tells us these guys care about killing us for sport, not out of anger. Initially it seems odd that they wouldn't care that we're killing all of their people, but their actions seem to replicate a hive mind like ants. With seemingly telepathic communication, maybe pheromones, their actions and incentives can be changed on a dime. But before all this fighting happens, we walk through the dark woods until the morning arrives. This gave me the impression that there'd be a day and night cycle, but that idea wasn't really explored. We arrive at the village as the sun rises and a bell tolls. There is a clear contrast between the small houses on the left and the looming castle to the right. Never mind the stronghold or Heisenberg's factory. But anyway, I felt that this contrast would be explored throughout the game, but it only lasted until the end of House Dimitrescu. More on that later. Before entering the castle, we have to play a Capcom treasure hunting game. This eventually leads us to the fateful house of Louisa. Earlier, we learned that the village's survivors grouped up in her home, and the house even seemed far enough from the Lycans to actually be a viable place to stay. Upon entering the house with Elena and her sick father, we hear a cheesy speech from Drunk McGee.
Tomorrow we'll all be dead. Just like her damn husband. Put a sock in it, Roxana!
Okay. Then we do a weird ritual prayer with the survivors. The prayer is to Mother Miranda, which explains the spooky Christ-like pictures we found throughout the village. Based on some notes found throughout the game, we can speculate that the lichens have always been a problem. Mother Miranda has just kept them in check as long as the villagers worship her. Elena's father turns into a lichen, and for some reason not a single person has a weapon to stop him. I'm okay with the house burning down, though it doesn't need to, but having everyone die here didn't make a ton of sense, since Ethan and a couple of the others should have weapons on hand. After this, we get the most cheese wheel death for Elena imaginable. It was completely avoidable. She didn't need to go down, even if she wanted to help her zombie dad, and she had already shot him twice with a shotgun. This was the first time in the game that I felt that something was lost. Not a loss that was impactful or thematic, but just cheesy and ridiculous. And of course, the cheesiest death ever was followed up by a lame-ass reaction by Ethan.
Why is everyone dying on me? This is just too much.
One strange comment Elena makes before her demise is that Castle Dimitrescu is
full of nothing but blood and death.
In the chapel, we see Mother Miranda and the leaders of the four houses, including Lady Dimitrescu. That means the people in the village know these figures and worship them, perhaps as saints, alongside Mother Miranda. Elena's comment seems to credit her more intelligence than she's actually given, so I'm even more disappointed that the writers didn't give her a little more time before that cheesy death. We see Mother Miranda kill another survivor outside Louisa's house, which tells her that she wants everyone in the village dead, but I don't think she's all-knowing. After all, we know that she has some control over the lichens, but they didn't kill Mr. Plastic Face until Ethan ran in his house and nearly got blasted with a shotgun. Also, I can only reasonably see that guy missing his shot if he was turned around when Ethan opened the curtain. So, other villagers might have had a shot at surviving if they hadn't all been killed by Elena's papa. Then we have our first encounter with Heisenberg.
You must be pretty tough, huh?
The shock value of a Magneto in a Resident Evil game was an interesting little twist, but there are a lot of thematic problems with Heisenberg. We'll get to him later. Heisenberg takes us to the Mother Miranda family meeting. After a heated debate between Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg, Mother Miranda chooses to let Heisenberg put on a show. We know that Miranda wants Ethan to live, or at least wants him to try to live. We'll get to that later. So she may have chosen Heisenberg thinking Ethan would have a better shot at escaping his traps than go wherever Dimitrescu would have taken him. It's possible that Dimitrescu and her daughters would have immediately consumed Ethan if Miranda gave the go-ahead. The only reason they didn't eat him when he got meat-hooked later is because Dimitrescu had to ask Miranda what to do with him. Ethan had a couple of good lines in this scene.
Hey, don't I get a say in this?
Felt quippy in a Resident Evil main character sort of way, while the second was a believably panicked Ethan.
No, wait!
We're then thrown into a bizarre world of traps and lichen chases. This circus of horror was powerfully thematic with the lichens under the bidding of their rulers, Lady Dimitrescu and friends. The end of the scene shows Ethan basically melting his metal shackles off from the friction between those shackles and the spinning death roller, which would be pretty hot on his hands, by the way. Like, potentially third-degree burns hot, since metal conducts heat very quickly. But given what we learn about Ethan later, it's not really significant. For some reason, Heisenberg acts like Ethan has been killed. He seems to have visual access to all the trapped rooms in the maze, so he definitely would have seen Ethan survive at the end. Though that's okay given Heisenberg's rebellious nature. It's possible he was already planning to have Ethan join the rebellion if he proved his strength, but there's no way to know that. Assuming that was his plan, there is a pretty big problem here. Wouldn't the other house leaders see him escape the traps? Heisenberg mentions that he needs to keep Beneviento and Moreau entertained, which only makes sense if those two are watching Ethan trying to survive. Dimitrescu is reasonably pissed and thinks the circus is stupid, so it makes sense she wouldn't watch. We also know Miranda wants Ethan to live, or is at least indifferent to his survival. If the cameras in the cave are angled away from the wall that Ethan hides in, then the others would reasonably be unable to tell whether or not he survived the last trap. But installing the camera in that direction makes little sense since the purpose of the traps is to see people get eviscerated. These traps are pretty worn, and we see inactive traps once we escape. So the cave wasn't just made for Ethan. Heisenberg might have been putting on a show for Donna and Moreau to distract them from the fact that Ethan actually survives, since they would definitely mention Ethan's survival to Miranda. to keep the others from seeing Ethan escape, Heisenberg would immediately have to turn off the TV. We then meet our friend, the Duke. I like the Duke, his mysterious nature and movements, his odd comments and tastes. The only problem I have with his execution is that you're always safe when you enter his shop. You can literally have Lady Dimitrescu behind you as you enter the Duke's shop, but once you enter, she will back off as if he has some special Dimitrescu bug spray on the door.
No sign of Rose.
I don't think the four houses would like the Duke, giving Ethan the tools to destroy them, though Miranda herself might believe that she completely outclasses Ethan anyway, and she should have. So giving us constant access to the Duke in these scenarios is a bit cheesy. One solution to this is to have him close shop with a sort of curtain when an enemy NPC approaches from a room or so away. Another solution is to have him mysteriously disappear when someone like Lady Dimitrescu is approaching from a couple rooms away. There's always a secret door, right? Part 3, The Castle. We then get our first glimpse into the detailed and beautiful castle. I think they did a great job with the aesthetic of the castle, and this emphasized the castle versus village theme I've described before. Our entry is immediately followed by the three daughters dragging and meat-hooking us under Lady Dimitrescu's command. This scene is actually iconic. Dimitrescu initially facing away from us is a move of absolute confidence. Ethan is the underdog here, and really he's completely helpless. She even calls Ethan's blood stale in a move that kinda reminds me of the Oracle in The Matrix when she tells Neo he's not the one. He's left chained on hooks with no reasonable means to escape, and the way he does escape is badass. He's an absolute dad. Then I laughed when he poured the chemical fluid and herb mixture or first aid on his hands, like that would fix it, but it's another small hint at his body's true nature. I don't really understand how his body works since Dimitrescu doesn't seem to notice a difference between his blood and other humans' blood. Maybe he has real blood then, and in turn bone marrow, since that's where blood comes from, and maybe bones? I'm not sure what's real or fake in his body, but that's fine for now. Then we're introduced to the Four Angels puzzle, which could have easily been placed in a Devil May Cry game. I guess that's just Capcom's style, but the puzzle doesn't really make sense canonically. Why would Dimitrescu put a puzzle in her own house that requires her and her daughters to walk everywhere? What's the point of keeping that door closed? If someone really wanted the Dagger of Death's flowers, which is basically imbued with a bunch of poisons, they could have snuck around, climbed up the cliffside, or flew in a Chris Redfield TM helicopter. It takes too long to get outside with the mask puzzle, even if all four house members grab one, so they should have gotten rid of it. The castle itself has three main areas. The main level, which includes everything from Dimitrescu's room to the Duke's store, the basement, and the rooftops. Of these three floors, the least interesting is the rooftop. Here the only enemy type is the gargoyle, and this floor is only used to obtain one of the masks. The basement is where we have some tough encounters with Dimitrescu, one of the daughters, and the Bloodless Women. The Bloodless Women carry the tone of the basement. And the basement itself has a diverse array of rooms, from beautiful statues to creepy dungeons to downright scary blood rooms. The main level has the most diversity with puzzles, story, and fights, while keeping us on our toes with encounters from the daughters and Lady Dimitrescu. This floor is also one of the most iconically beautiful areas in gaming history, which contrasts perfectly with the depravity in the hidden sections of the castle and the village outside. Over the course of finding these puzzle pieces, we enter every part of this cursed and gorgeous castle. We encounter one daughter very early on, who is relatively easy to kill once we break a window that she didn't think about, I guess. Engaging Ethan in a room with a window makes no sense if the air outside insta-wrecks your invincibility. If the Dimitrescu family was careful, they would have gotten bulletproof windows, but that's not guaranteed since I don't think they expected to have people running through or outside their house filling their windows with holes. Also, we don't know how much information Mother Miranda gave to Lady Dimitrescu about the potential Chris Redfield TM agencies that might come after them in their little village. Anyway, each of the daughters are engaging boss encounters, but I felt like they were less menacing than expected, since they couldn't even handle a little chilly weather like Dimitrescu. After all, Ethan is barely wearing winter clothing, but he gets along fine outside. It can't be that cold, even with Ethan's special abilities. Perhaps especially because of his special abilities. Also, is it just me or do the daughters all look the same? It would be nice if they had different strengths and were distinct in weapon choice, face shape, or body type, or all three, but their hair colors are the only good way to tell them apart. As the daughters are killed, Lady Dimitrescu becomes more and more desperate and exasperated. One of my favorite scenes is when Ethan gets his hand cut off and we have to escape to the fountain as Dimitrescu chases us down. I do have a problem with her letting Ethan off the hook so frequently. When she comes back into the dressing room, she smashes Ethan into the ground until he breaks to the floor. It's possible she used enough force to seriously injure a normal human, but then she doesn't strategically try to kill him later either. When she cuts off his hand, she may have wanted to torture him, but should have had enough experience with attempted escapees to guard the door while trying to contact one of her daughters. At least then, Ethan would have to find another passageway to escape through. For the scene in the dressing room, I think Ethan should have been the one to break the floor, maybe with his shotgun to escape. Once the angel face puzzle is complete, we exit to a chapel where we find remains and a dagger, and Lady Dimitrescu is right there with us. Ethan is slashed by all of her claws, probably pretty deeply, though his clothes might take some of the blow. I say slash because I don't think he'd be up and kicking immediately after getting 5 stab wounds to the gut. We're then grabbed with a talon, not by her
Horrible toothy mon.
which I don't really get. Then we're slammed against the wall of the tower and luckily land on sturdy ground. This seems a bit over the top and hard to justify. Can't you choose something else just as flashy if you're looking for flashy? Why not get a helicopter rope from Chris, sneaky Redfield, and have a chase down around the castle? There are a lot of options here and a lot of them aren't as goofy as what we get. During the boss battle, Dimitrescu basically loses it. Her regeneration powers go into overdrive because of the dagger's poison, causing her to become the massive beast with the
Toothy maw.
I guess this regeneration also makes her crazy because she starts howling like a sorority girl on her 5th drink. Overall, the boss battle is at first terrifying and then a little goofy. If her biology was really going crazy, then why give her normal vocal cords to say stupid stuff? Why not make her sound like a real monster when you fight her rather than a cheese wheel? Maybe at the very end she screams "Winters" to show her hatred, but otherwise it's a bit much. But then Ethan tops it off with,
You're the one who's cursed.
a way to get her. God, these lines are so dumb. Part 4, Beneviento. After that fight, we receive a piece of our daughter's body, which was split up for some reason. I kind of appreciate the folky nature of reviving Rose as Evelyn during the midnight moon.
As the midnight moon rises on black wings, we await the light at the end.
But in light of the scientific parallels every creature has with real life, I don't see a reason for the delay except to test Ethan. But test Ethan for what? The only reason I can see Miranda using Ethan to kill all her failed experiments is to prevent their jealousy when she runs off with Evelyn. Except she seems indifferent to Ethan's success throughout the game. She says later that she's done testing him as a lab rat, but she, as a scientist, would know that makes no sense. What experiments? Is his ability to reattach his hand that informative? What actual data has she gathered on his fungal nature? Maybe she took a sample from him when she broke out of the trunk, but then what's the point of testing him later? That comment just seems like a little bit of quippy cheese. She knows her children are loyal to her, so she could even entrust them with special responsibilities to raise Evelyn, and she could always treat Dimitrescu like the special child of the 4 houses to keep her loyalty. So basically, she's just an asshole who doesn't care about the people she's hung out with for the past few decades. Returning to the story, we never go to the castle again, and the theme starts to shift from the contrast between the castle and village to something unrecognizable. It takes a while though, so don't mind my foreshadowing. The Duke fills us in on the Rose Flask dilemma, which is understandably shocking to Ethan. Then he sends us off to the Red Chimney House. This next part is our last extended sequence in the village. Aside from the Chris of Duty scene, which really doesn't count, it had interesting new houses with cool combat geography, a new enemy, and a fun little puzzle. This last trek through the village both maintains the theme and expands on it. After returning from the Red Chimney House, the Duke gives us an exposition dump about the houses, and then we receive an easy-to-use, super convenient treasure map about every hidden treasure in the game. What can I say? I guess that's fine. We then move on to House Beneviento, which is quite literally a house. Okay, I know that's the way to address a family. I've read Game of Thrones, but still, it's just one lady in a house. Not much of a house, right? Unless you include the baby. The house is right next to a cliffside far away from the village proper. Fog covers the small gated yard outside the house, and we're greeted with nothing. We encounter Beneviento's doll Angie in the basement in front of a Mia doll. She has the next rose flask on her lap until the lights go out for what seems like a moment until we find ourselves without any items whatsoever. Since Beneviento's specialty is hallucination, I can imagine he was knocked out or gassed unconscious, but the real question is why Beneviento doesn't just kill Ethan when it's easy, since he's completely helpless at the time. We know she has killed her other playmates in the past, so she's got no qualms with murder, but she does have some parallels with Domitrescu. Mommy issues! None of the 4 children feel like Mother Miranda cares about them enough. Domitrescu wishes she was favored over the other children, Moreau feels uncared for, and Heisenberg wants to start a rebellion. So, as any rational adult would do, Beneviento tries to get Ethan to be her daddy. Not like that! By playing puzzle games, introducing hallucinogens, and summoning a demon baby. Obviously, she has some mental issues, but a lot of people have mental issues and they don't go around murdering everyone they meet. Even though I feel bad for her in some ways, she's obviously become a serial killer, like every other house leader. First, I thought this house was pretty straightforward and didn't need much analysis, but on a second glance, there are a few things I want to address. We hear Mia's voice several times on the radio in the Mia doll room. The first signal we pick up is from Mia's pregnancy. How could Beneviento have heard this interaction? We know that Ethan and Mia moved to their European house sometime in the last 3 years, so it's possible Mother Miranda put some noise-sensitive spy equipment near their house sometime before switching places with Mia. If Beneviento had access to these recordings, then the other houses would almost definitely have access too, except for Moreau. Later radio signals seem to be from Mia talking to herself, or maybe to their doctor. She has to come to terms with the idea that she's in love with a mold man, which is understandably spooky. All that's clear in these messages is that Mia's hiding something she had to do. Oddly, Ethan gets a phone call where Mia directly addresses him, but it's possible she was reciting this inside their house before her abduction. The last 2 messages before Monster Baby may have been recorded while she was captured, since she seems hysterical. Another somewhat less likely possibility is that Ethan is just hallucinating his fears in the radio and phone. It's less likely because we see Ethan's vision blur after he escapes the cute little monster baby, which hints that there's something messing with his head at that point. Compliments to the chef for the monster baby. Its movement, body, noise, design, everything has been perfectly crafted to terrify. Even the way it eats you looks like it's hurting itself. And then we get to the doll scene. Beneviento can separate pieces of herself, her cadeau, and have them survive. In this scene, the dolls fly around, but I don't think they actually do. It's probably just part of the hallucination, since there's really nothing to let them fly around. Beneviento probably messed with his mind, which made him believe they could fly. During the hide-and-seek match, when we stab Angie, we're actually stabbing Beneviento. It's pretty chilling to imagine a game of hide-and-seek where a mentally ill woman is chased around by a drugged-up man with scissors. Anyway, once she's stabbed enough, she dies, and apparently all her dolls do too. The dolls like Angie don't run around anymore, so we can assume once she died, all her Godot counterparts died. The question is, why? Each of these Cadeau descendants should act independently of their parent Cadeau. Even if they function like ants with the queen and her subjects, they would still survive for some time independently after the death of the queen. I assume they communicate through pheromones, so if they learn about the queen's death, they'd have some response, but instant death isn't typically on the menu. I'd like to take a second to list what we know about the Megamycete's powers just after Beneviento's house. Human synthesizing mold. Bug-like structures that can physiologically and psychologically replicate a human. Pheromone communicating organisms. Rapidly regenerating microstructures, blood-sucking beings, non-blood-sucking beings, and hungry lichens who can also wield basic weaponry. The list becomes outlandishly long by the second half of the game, which definitely contributes to the game's chaotically jumbled themes. I'm looking at you, Magneto.
Part 5, House Moreau.
We run back through the village only to be greeted by a monster reminiscent of the beast that ate Finnick in the Hunger Games. This brought me back to the near-death experience at the beginning of the game, so I welcomed it. We also find out that Louise's husband tried to fight it only to die from blood loss. I think it's cool that this random guy turned out to be someone we had heard of in the past, except it's less exciting and interesting since he was already dead. His survival would be optional if Elena and potentially others had survived the house fire, but it feels like something was lost again because they chose to kill off literally everyone in the village. After grabbing one of the most useful guns in the game, the wolf monster is still gnarly to take down. This monster is a good example of the diversity that can come from the Megamycete if it only had half its powers. I'm a little disappointed that we don't see any more lichen types after this. I understand the whole lichen thing means wolf-like, but I don't think the Megamycete cares about that. From here on, we get to see Ethan bully Moreau.
I'll just be taking this.
I feel bad for Moreau, and Ethan gives a little synopsis of why after killing him.
In death as he was in life. Disgusting.
I don't know what angle Capcom was going for in this, but I enjoy killing Moreau in the same way I enjoy running over pedestrians in GTA. Dear news networks, no one actually gets hurt, so it's fun to pretend. It kind of put a dark twist on Ethan's character, which was unexpected in a game where he gives enough cheesy lines that he reminds me of Season 8 Jon Snow.
My queen.
The fish aquifer dam setting was fine, but it felt very different from the little snowcat village next to the big castle. But not the worst, yet. We also get to meet our friendly neighborhood Chris Redfield, who still has existential crisis level social awkwardness. Just say you didn't kill Mia. Just say it. Just do it, you moron. We also get an Ethan who reacts to his wife's murderer the same way I'd react to someone who steals my shrimpies.
Sure, Chris. Why not? You killed Mia. Now do me and finish the job.
This house was mostly water puzzles, and fighting. The most memorable part, though, was the boss fight. I have to be honest, I can't help it. Here are some of the hilarious lines from this fight. And that's it for the third flask. Part 6. The Mania of Heisenberg. Immediately after killing Moreau, we enter his hideout where we see a cadeau for the first time. I don't really know how these are implanted in people. Maybe they just get a rope and tie it on until it emerges with the person? Or maybe they cut the cadavers/people open and plant it in their chest? Who knows? Then we're contacted by Heisenberg on the TV. I guess he spies on Moreau? Anyway, he points out something pretty obvious. What will Ethan do with the flasks once he gets all of them? Ethan would basically be helpless to save his daughter without his enemies. We know that Miranda can use the Megamycete to reassemble Rose since she does that at the end of the game, but we have to assume that either Heisenberg knows how to reassemble Rose, or that he will take Rose once Miranda has revived her. We then go to Heisenberg's stronghold, where he's told us to find his personal Rose flask. This is an action-packed yet thematically sound fight. The first fight in the courtyard can technically be skipped by pulling the gate levers, but that becomes much more difficult in the hardcore and Village of Shadows difficulties. The second fight is in the Lycan stronghold and requires a lot of maneuvering to succeed. The third fight is against zombie claws, and there's not a lot else to it. One of the main problems with this sequence is how clearly divided the waves are. If every Lycan was to charge at Ethan or shoot at him at once, there'd be no way for him to fight them head on by himself. In the village, the sporadic appearances of the Lycans make sense since their base of operations is elsewhere, though, to be honest, I think it should be farther away. Once Ethan arrives at their base and starts blowing Lycans up, the big boss Megamycete should send enough to drive him off, or surround him if he sticks around. Well, that is, unless Miranda's interfering with the fight. We see a bunch of crows flying above the stronghold courtyard as we begin the fight, and we see Miranda transform into crows multiple times throughout the game. That means it's possible Miranda was sending small waves of Lycans to fight Ethan, essentially holding back a horde. But wouldn't Heisenberg realize the Lycans were acting differently than they normally would? After all, this group of psychos seems well acquainted with tapping a place with mics and cameras. Well, yes, but he already knows that Miranda's testing Ethan, which would make the wave nonsense standard practice. But if he understood the Lycan's normal behavior, Miranda would have to be subtle in her wave strategy, or else she would let on to Heisenberg that she knew about his betrayal. To clarify, Miranda has to act like she doesn't know about Heisenberg's betrayal, so she would have to make the waves against Ethan in the stronghold seem generic enough that a non-betraying Heisenberg would watch his TV and think this Lycan's behavior made sense. This also explains why she doesn't just make the Lycans leave. That would not be anywhere near their normal behavior. Honestly though, I don't think she does a good enough job at smoothing the waves. Every Lycan wave starts when Ethan gets to a certain distance from the stronghold or a certain distance in the stronghold. Sure, if Ethan charges in, they all come at once, but a real-world Ethan would not do that. No one would do that! Instead, he tried to pick them off one at a time and slowly close the gap to the stronghold. But Heisenberg doesn't let on to Ethan that Miranda might already know about his betrayal. Instead, he seems to think he will go in guns blazing and surprise her. He really seems like Lady Dimitrescu's little kid brother who builds a big robot. So I guess it doesn't matter after all. Miranda's playing chess badly while Heisenberg is playing checkers. Maybe Miranda knew that Heisenberg was just an idiot and got lazy with the stronghold part. But that's pretty disappointing. Heisenberg was probably planning his rebellion for years, but for some reason, he never thought Miranda could catch on to him. We'll get to another Heisenberg absurdity in a minute, but I'm surprised how disappointed I ended up being, story-wise, with a part of the game that seems so straightforward. We then complete the Giant's Chalice with Rose's parts, and place it on a plinth that descends into darkness. The darkness of Heisenberg's factory. A bridge also rises leading to the factory. Things just happen here, seemingly without reason. Why make a Giant's Chalice that will activate a one-use elevator to cross a shaky split bridge that seems to have been made in the 14th century? When and why did Heisenberg or whoever install the system that separately lifts the 3, 4, however many bridge segments? We know there are other ways to get out of the village since Ethan came in another way, and the bridge just leads out of the village, which means there's really no purpose to this bridge but to look cool. Then we see Heisenberg's arts and crafts conspiracy board. The board is really goofy, which fits Heisenberg perfectly. The leftmost image is a map that looks like a printout of Ethan's menu map with the words BSAA come, where BSAA is code for what used to be the Chris Redfield Foundation. I doubt they know that Chris is no longer in the BSAA, so he's probably referring to Chris and his team. BSAA come sounds more like a command than a reminder. We don't really know the timeline for when he wrote this stuff, but it seems to have come before Beneviento's picture was put up. Maybe Heisenberg was excited about how quickly things were developing, and right after he heard about Chris Redfield and co entering the village, which would have been at the start of the game, he started putting posters up. Like an excited little boy, he seems to have put the remaining images of his family in preparation for his rebellion. The red X on Moreau seems to continue under Beneviento's picture, so he probably forgot about her at first, given the symmetry of Moreau and Dimitrescu beside Miranda. We also see pictures of Chris, Mia, and Rose to the right of Dimitrescu, which all seems to have been taken at or before the game's start within the Winter's home, which supports the camera surveillance idea from before. Wait, did Ethan have sex with... Anyway, Heisenberg tells us about his rebellion, which involves using Rose, who apparently has a ton of power. How would he use the power of a baby? Well, I think he'd use his skills in biotechnology to activate aggression in her mind at will. It would definitely involve invasive surgery, and it would definitely psychologically damage her. Should Ethan have taken him up on the offer only to betray him later? I actually think Ethan made the right move here, even if it was just to be a gung-ho dad. So long as Rose was not revived, Heisenberg couldn't use her power, which gave Ethan time to get the strength to fight him. If he had gone along with Heisenberg's rebellion and successfully kidnapped Rose after her revival, Heisenberg would probably use his powers to threaten Rose's life and force Ethan to go along with his plans. Then we get into a whole factory of cyberpunk. There's no more village and castle dichotomy, just rusted scraps and cyborgs. But the cyberpunk theme is pretty good and creates an aesthetic that you don't really see anywhere else in the game. I love the visual of the massive factory with cyborgs belted along the causeway. I enjoyed seeing the Duke hanging out in the elevator so you could always have access to him in multiple levels of the factory. The enemies are also kind of goofy, which is fine since it matches Heisenberg's goofiness. The bodies we see being belted through the factory just can't be different every time. If they were all different, then Heisenberg would have an army of millions. Instead, I think it's some sort of priming rotation. They probably travel on different conveyor belts, leading to tools with different purposes. I don't know what sort of priming corpses would need to have cybernetics planted in them, aside from preventing decomposition, but I guess it's fine since the visual's cool. We see notes around the factory that tell us he's using Miranda's Cadeau creatures to create cyborgs through electrical modifications. So like Frankenstein's monster monster in the movies. These corpses are turned into what would be lichens, but somehow they act very little like lichens. The experiments he describes are so vague yet have such good and variable results, I feel like we can attribute their successes to the Megamycete's properties rather than Heisenberg's intelligence. So now we have to add to the list of Megamycete powers electrical manipulation and also with Heisenberg, magnetic fields. Its abilities are just so broad it can do anything at this point. One strange aspect of Heisenberg's factory is that nothing works. It's like Heisenberg doesn't keep any part of the factory functional. It's possible this part of the factory isn't active anymore, since he seems to have automated at least some of the cyborg creation process. Some of the cyborgs mine raw materials from the ground, so we can reasonably assume they can also smelt the materials needed. I don't think they can manufacture the parts to create more cyborgs without automated processes, which is hinted at with the conveyor belt, so this broken down part of the factory is plausible. This portion of the game is surprisingly long, which keeps the tension high but also feels completely disconnected from the rest of the game. Put this section in a game called Resident Evil Cyberpunk and it's fine, but put it in a game called Resident Evil Village and I'm a little bamboozled, to be honest. Anyway, Heisenberg contacts us through multiple sections of our factory journey. If he knows where we are, why not just send the whole army at once? Well, it's possible Heisenberg is just blasting this radio signal throughout the entire factory. After all, what does he have to lose by doing so? One problem with this theory is that Ethan only had one way to escape the helicopter boy early on, which was through the shafts. If it took Heisenberg until a minute before his first radio signal to learn that Ethan survived the initial copter chase, then after that point, Ethan's possible location should have been swarmed with cyborgs. That assume Heisenberg even remembers how he built his factory, which is not a guarantee. I shrug, but I've shrugged a lot during Heisenberg's section, so it's no biggie, I guess. On the bright side, when we descend to mold different items, there are actually new cyborgs. But if Heisenberg knew Ethan would have to descend multiple times to cast different items, especially his key, then he should have sent a group of them to guard the casting machine. Obviously not all in one spot, but spaced enough around the machine to initially avoid getting blown up, while also pressuring Ethan constantly from all sides. That strategy assumes Heisenberg can tell his cyborgs to put their arms out and make sure they don't touch. Not that tough, I guess. The biggest problem with this section, aside from the story, is that it's so tedious. Trekking through and back and through and back and through this factory hellhole becomes more and more annoying as we encounter so many of the same type of enemy. Every now and then a new enemy will be introduced, but they're only used to get in the way. They're not enjoyably dynamic, just obnoxious obstacles. Once we do the dance and reach the top, we encounter Heisenberg again, who doesn't kill us, or really try to kill us since he knows about Ethan's body, but instead knocks us to the bottom of the factory. There's really no reason to keep Ethan alive. He's proven time and time again to be a problem when left alone, so this is a really bad mistake by Heisenberg. We then encounter Chris Redfield himself in the flesh, and the first thing he tells Ethan is that he's in the way. Great. Good to see you too. Then he says,
You think I killed Mia?
Oh, was that not clear all along? And then he tells Ethan,
Because I knew you would want to be involved!
When asked why he didn't immediately tell Ethan, here's the thing. Telling Ethan about Mia's non-death is at the very least a non-issue. Ethan isn't a danger without a weapon, so tell him it's not Mia, knock him out, and take him somewhere safe and keep him there until you finish the mission. Not telling him is a very bad way to make Ethan want to be uninvolved. Either way, he would want to be involved once Rose is kidnapped, so why not tell him before we fight the fish? It's just poor logic. So maybe he did it on purpose and is sadistic? The game doesn't portray him that way, so I doubt that's what Capcom was going for. Overall, good twist. Terrible execution. The coup de grace of stupidity here is that Ethan fights Heisenberg with a tank made of non-magnetic metals that Heisenberg made. Sure, have your little projects, have a little fun. But Heisenberg, buddy, the first thing that should come to your mind when you realize someone's lurking in your factory or realize something like the Chris Redfield Association might come to get you is to destroy pet projects you can't control that can kill you. Even if Heisenberg doesn't realize his factory could be infiltrated until Ethan comes along, all he had to do is destroy the elevator Ethan comes out of. Then suddenly, Chris's job becomes a lot more difficult. But I will say, the fight with Heisenberg is extremely fun. Like Godzilla vs. King Kong fun. It's absolutely ridiculous, and I love it. That's enough gushing though, because that fight was the final straw that killed the theme for me. Part 7, Call of Duty Zombies. Once Heisenberg's dead, Miranda comes and gives us a greeting. She tells Ethan that Rose is Evelyn's successor to controlling the mold, but I think she means that as a metaphor, and after some lore we've already discussed, Miranda knocks Ethan's heart out. After a brief moment of Chris Redfield's Sad Boy, we play Call of Duty Zombies. That's pretty much it. There goes all the tension and horror, but again, the combat is really fun and a great contrast to Ethan's scrappy fighting style. Chris is an expert against biohazards, so it makes sense he is more competent than Ethan. He also has infinite ammo, basically, so he has few qualms with wasting a clip to stay safe. One problem with the Megamycete here that we've seen before with Beneviento is that all the lichens die when a part of their central hub is hit, as we see when using the laser pointer to target a clump of the Megamycete. At the end of this sequence, Mia tells Chris that Ethan's a special boy. We also learn that Umbrella's founder Oswald Spencer was inspired by Miranda to make Umbrella. If only Miranda survived. Ethan's vision and fight with Miranda was pretty straightforward. It's kind of funny how much they banter during the fight.
How can you deny me? Why the hell can't you realize Rose is my goddamn kid?
And at the end, he saves Rose and for some reason decides to go back to kiss the Megamycete. The Duke hints that we're falling apart and that there's no return to our old life, but there's never an explanation as to why. Maybe Ethan didn't want Mia to see him falling apart, but because we're not given that juicy explanation, we're left to guess at why it seems so obvious to everyone else he was going to die. We don't know if Ethan can regenerate his heart, so for the story to make sense, we have to believe that Ethan can live without a heart for a long period of time, but will still die relatively soon. One problem with this idea is that he needs to circulate oxygen through his body that he breathes in, so he almost definitely regenerated his heart. Whatever though. I'm disappointed that Miranda died, given her importance in the Resident Evil lore. She could have easily run with the baby, even with her deteriorating powers. She should have run away since she knew that Team Chris was on the way to take her out. During the fight, she claims that Ethan killed her false children and awakened the Megamycete. Does she mean that killing her false children caused the Megamycete to awaken? There's no indication that this happened, but if it did, Miranda should have immediately killed her false children to revive Rose as quickly as possible. After all, she knows Chris is after her and is the real deal with airstrikes at his command. Ethan took a while to kill all those false children, so it seems silly for her to just leave it to Ethan. One last thing about the boss fight. If Ethan was surrounded by the Megamycete, why didn't she just use it to crush him completely? There was no way out for him, and that would have been an easy finish. Also, did Chris let Miranda and Ethan duke it out solo for any particular reason? Earlier we had a whole squad lighting the village up, and we see that they survived later. There doesn't seem to be a good reason for Chris, who already shot Miranda, to just sit back and do nothing. So what is he doing? On the helicopter at the end, we see Chris act like an annoying child, completely incapable of communicating with Mia, who is afraid for her husband's life. Poor Chris. Can't Mia understand that he just lost a friend and leave him alone? Poor guy. We also see that the BSAA, the group Chris used to work for, sent a bioweapon to the village. This is basically foreshadowing for the next game, paired with the end credit statement that the father's story is done. The credit scene basically matches nothing that happened in the game except that Ethan rescued Rose, but they leave out that Mia was also kidnapped by the witch and rescued by a government agent. I think it's kind of a cute scene, but a bit cringy. I like the bit about the father's sacrifice though. The post-credit scene with Rose is pretty straightforward, but she seems to have mold powers. I'd be interested to see what power she has since the Megamycete is gone, which is the center of Miranda's power. Rose is now a mold, Megamycete, and human mix, which will be interesting to see in future games. Part 8. A small revision. Now I want to talk about the changes I would suggest if this game was ever remade, which it won't. I think the game began with serious promise in terms of theme and characters, but it was slowly lost as we killed each member of Miranda's family. The village was soon just a passing interest while the castle was forgotten as the story moved forward. Instead, I think the entire game should be centered around the village and castle, but if we got rid of all the other areas, this game would be pretty short. I think we can expand the village into different segments that still feel like a village. I doubt anyone lived in the houses we ran through during during the battle with Moreau, and Beneviento's house is in the middle of nowhere by a cliffside. To simplify the process, I would place a small hamlet by the aquifer that has a road leading back to the village proper. Maybe there's also a folk tale about a monster that dwells in the river, so they only let the aquifer out at night. I also think the village proper was quite small. I don't know how hundreds of lichens were created from only like 10 houses, but that seems unlikely. Beneviento's house could stand out as an odd contrast to the destruction around the rest of the village, but more on that later. Domitreska and her daughters would be the main antagonists. If we change the daughters' designs and powers, we could add some interesting diversity to their fights. One daughter would have the exact powers, design, weapons, looks, and personality as the three we encounter in the castle, but the others would be quite different. There are many body shapes, so we just choose two and give those to the other daughters. For weapons, one might have a scythe while the other dual wields meat cleavers. Instead of giving all the daughters the same power, one of them, the scythe daughter, could enter the ground like Miranda instead of being made of bugs. The meat cleaver daughter could be the most difficult, with a power that fills people with toxic spores, so approaching her is dangerous, though avoiding her is difficult too, since she would charge at you at full speed. I don't think the daughters should die so early in the game either. Instead, I think the game should have utilized a day-night cycle. Even though the whole game takes place in a day, we could slow down Ethan's healing ability to make resting necessary. After all, Ethan never noticed before that he had some crazy healing abilities. During the day, it would be warm enough that the daughters can encounter Ethan while taking like a fifth of the damage they would take at night. We'd rarely encounter them at night, but maybe a part of the game is figuring out how to ambush them at that time. One problem with this idea is that Chris is running around making a mess during the game too. If at the start of the game, Ethan had woken up to Mia and Rose screaming, only to find them missing, he could have followed the trail she intentionally left behind. That almost gives away the mystery of the village's location, but if he followed her and saw the trail led into the woods for miles, that would definitely create some mystery, especially if the trail behind him was snowed in while the one in front was relatively fresh. That would buy Ethan some time before the Chris Communication Foundation found out Ethan was missing. Moving on, I think 2 or 3 of the villagers, including Elena, should have survived Elena's dad. It's not necessary to have Mother Miranda want to kill them, or if she does, know that they're alive. If Louise's house burns down and the survivors realize Mother Miranda is out to get them, they will play safer, maybe even stay in Louise's courtyard. I think Elena should be able to help Ethan with village business too. I can imagine a radio signal being sent to Ethan at sensible times when he is in the castle, telling him to go somewhere and do something in the village. Elena could realistically survive with a food and water pack, slowly traveling between houses when lichens aren't around. It's not easy, but even that old man could do it until he shot the wall. I also think the castle should be expanded. Have multiple areas on the rooftops with enemies who attack once you enter the area. There are so many viable ideas for lichen anatomy, e.g. the doggos and gargoyles, that monster design should be less of a problem than it seems to be. I also think the castle should include a courtyard like most massive castles. That would give room for stables, guardhouses, and other buildings with content. There could also be multiple levels of a ballroom and other smaller rooms if necessary. I don't think the front and side doors should be locked, and if they are, then there should be passageways leading out of the castle. That way we can move between the village and castle depending on what's happening in the story. Secret passageways are standard practice in castles as well, so it's realistic. Rather than get an exposition dump from the Duke, Elena would be our partner in crime. Elena could contact you at some point in the castle about a village shaman who says she can help you, but then that shaman is just Beneviento, who turns out to be one of Miranda's failed experiments, and the whole meeting goes awry. We get separated from Elena and have to survive House Beneviento, similar to the current Beneviento house. At the end, we get the first flask of rose. I think the rose flask idea is still viable. Miranda could have given a flask to Domitresk, another to Domitresk's daughters, one to Beneviento, and another to the fish monster Moreau. Elena could find out through some digging that Moreau had a treasure that might include a rose flask, but once Ethan goes there and grabs the flask, he has to kill Moreau and escape. But what about Heisenberg? Oh, he'll still exist, but not as Miranda's son or as Magneto. He could be a conspiratorial engineer turned farmer who helps you set up traps for the sisters. But instead of wanting to use Rose against Miranda, he would try to stop her plans, culminating in him trying to destroy the flasks Ethan has collected. It doesn't have to be an extremely difficult boss fight, but given enough traps, chasing him down could be a problem. We would also find him with Helena's help. At this point, all three sisters, Moreau and Beneviento, would be dead, while Dimitrescu is on the warpath. Ethan could have stolen Dimitrescu's jar and would have the sister's jar somehow, which would tilt her even more. Then the Megamycete would stir the Lycans to flood the village, where many would be drawn to Ethan's location because of all the racket. This stirring would happen during the fight with Heisenberg. And after Heisenberg, we would defend ourselves using his tools. Slowly his defenses would fall apart, and as we're about to get rushed by 100 zombies, Chris and his team swoop in. Sure, we can enter Chris's perspective and play Call of Duty Zombies again, but this time Ethan would be boarded up trying to keep the Lycans from coming in. Except, when the team finally reaches him, Ethan has already been killed, and Chris and co. have to come up with a plan of action. Chris and fam would head to the Megamycete once their preparations were complete, but plenty of Lycans would be there to hold them back. In the meantime, Ethan would get Duke driven up to the castle where he would prepare for the final conflict. I think there'd need to be cutscenes where Chris finds evidence of the Winter's whereabouts and follows the clues, but I think it works better than
Ethan, no.
Before Ethan wakes up, Chris would find Mia in a strange lab, since we have not seen Miranda all game, just heard of her, maybe caught a glimpse. Ethan would enter the courtyard and place the rose flasks inside, only to be greeted by Dimitrescu. Part 1 of the boss fight would be fighting her in the courtyard in her human form after stabbing her with a dagger we found with her flask. Then, after taking enough damage, she transforms into a spider beast that chases Ethan around the castle. It would be great if she destroys sections of the castle along the way. Finally, we reach the rooftops where she grows wings and Chris comes in with a couple helicopters trying to pick Ethan up, only to have Dimitrescu crash Ethan's helicopter into the roof. Chris in his helicopter and Ethan would duo this form of Dimitrescu to death. In the meantime, Elena would be found in the village. Maybe she's the last one alive of the initial survivors, maybe not. It could depend on your choices. Anyway, while we were fighting Dimitrescu, Miranda would use that time to form a cocoon of Megamycete where she's completed Rose's revival. I think Chris would blast it open with an airstrike, and he and Ethan would duke it out with Mother Miranda to get Rose back. At the end of the fight, we beat her and take Rose. Ethan falls apart, and Elena and Mia leave together holding Rose. We can keep the Rose post-credit scene and add another at the end of the book reading, where we see a flock of birds flying away from the village's explosion as we zoom in on one of its eyes and fade to black. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please give it a like. This is my first video essay ever. And if you're not over this game yet, check out my Let's Play on Hardcore.